Planning Commission City Council Joint Workshop. Today is Thursday, May 23rd, and it is 5 o'clock. This is a workshop, and so no votes will be taken tonight. And if you would like to, Becky, I think you're here. If you would like to have any comments given to the Planning Commission or the City Council, we will have comment cards out in the hallway later. Yes. Later. Can I go ahead and clean up the overnight rental thing right now? Nora, go ahead.
You turn it over to me?
Yeah.
This is really weird. I'm not used to facing with my back to you, and just sort of the way it is. But I'm Nora Shepherd. I'm the planning director for Moab. I am not the consultant that came up with all this stuff. I am just sort of facilitating this meeting so that Planning Commission and City Council can really sit down and work through sort of where we are and what direction we're going, and give feedback to the consultants so that then they can come up with sort of their next draft of things. So I prepared a really brief slide presentation, well, sort of brief, but that talks a little bit about context and what we really need to talk about and some of those kinds of things. So this is what I like to talk about, and I know this looks really long, but it's not as bad as it looks, because I'll go through some of these things pretty quickly. But we're going to talk about the process today, context, a little bit about the number of existing units and the number of units that are already vested or in the pipeline under construction or almost. Review of direction given at the Joint City Council work session. Talk about the overlay districts. Look at the overlay map a little bit if you guys decide that's the direction you want to go. And talk about existing overnight accommodations and what you want to do with those. And then conclusions and direction to the consultants. And whatever else you want to talk about. So to date, for everybody's benefit, this is just a quick summary. So on February 5th, there was a temporary land use regulation that was adopted by the City Council. The County Council adopted one within a few days of this. And the purpose was really to look at land use regulation, specifically as it relates to overnight accommodations. Landmark Design was hired as a consultant to assist the city and county in the development of this, of new ordinances. There were public scoping meetings held on March 26th and 27th. Sorry, everybody around.
Jeanette.
Just shaking things up a little bit. And then there were a number of outreach community group meetings that Zachariah, the county, primarily did during April. There was a public workshop on April 30th, and we talked about 5 alternatives at that meeting and broke out into groups. And then the alternatives were refined. And then there was a joint city-county council meeting on May 7th, where, and shortly after that, there was a summary of direction that the consultants heard from that meeting, and that was sent out on May 14th. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then there was a draft approach and code that was distributed to you folks a couple days ago, hot off the press. I don't expect us to get into the weeds on the overlay ordinances per se. I haven't really had a lot of time to go through them. I went through one pass, but they've since revised them. So we can talk about the concept a little bit and the fact that there are 3 of them proposed. And then if you decide you want to go that route, then I would ask that you all review those documents and get comments back to me so that we can pass those along. So context, and I apologize, this is a little small, but so the first thing, there's this temporary land use ordinance or moratorium in effect, which exists, and it's going to expire. And so the first thing we need to do is kind of deal with that big thing, the temporary ordinance expiring. So we want to have something in place at that point that at least is a guideline for overnight accommodations, at least for the short term. And it's expected that we will follow up with other zoning initiatives immediately after. So the first priority is to talk about where new overnight accommodations would be allowed, if any, and under what circumstances. How we address existing projects, which is really important, I think. Whether to create the overlays or not, and if they are created, where they should be applied. And then some of the things that we'll follow up with, we're talking about mixed-use zoning and perhaps in the future looking at requiring mixed use with overnight accommodations and encouraging some of those retail uses. Additional performance standards above and beyond what the first draft of this code might say. Community commercial nodes, which is something we talked about, looking at the zoning there and encouraging more resident-based commercial uses. And then a review of the uses in the C4 and RC zone to make sure that we are encouraging a variety of commercial uses other than overnight accommodations, to make sure that there's still a lot of viable uses in those areas if we're scaling back on overnight accommodations, and to make sure that we think as a community we have the right mix. So this is just a little bit, there were lots of emails flying around and discussion about numbers of existing units and what's in the pipeline. And based upon various people's calculation, there are lots of existing units, 3,895, although those numbers are, some of those units are bigger and have lots of bedrooms, and depends on how you count them, and that's an approximation. But then there are pending units in the pipeline. And the county has done an evaluation, and we have done an evaluation. The county thinks there's about 576 additional nightly overnight accommodations that are in the works somewhere, and we actually have about 833. And that includes the Lions.
What's 595?
Yeah, it's
Oh, I see.
595 and then plus the Lions back.
Thank you.
So these projects are either in the approval process somewhere, and they submitted an application, a complete application before the moratorium, or they are trying to get ready for building permits, so they've received some approval from the City Council or Planning Commission, or they're under construction or about to pull building permits. So they kind of fall in a bunch of different categories. And I've listed the active projects, or the ones that are coming online regardless of what we do tonight. So there's 595 in the Radcliffe, Worldmark, Element or Slick Rock, Moab My Place, the Clays, Henry Shaw. And then there are an additional 238, plus or minus, depending on how you calculate them, in Lions Back. And Lions Back has received a master plan approval, and they are basically vested for those units, so they would not be subject to any kind of a moratorium or new regulations. And so we have to consider those as well. And it'll be built in phases over quite a period of time.
Nora, I'm seeing a lot of cell phones up taking pictures of this particular slide. Maybe we can make a copy of that or have it available.
I can post the whole slideshow or whatever.
On our website, that would be great.
Yeah.
Where would we post it?
Probably on the website for the project.
Moab land use.
Moab land use.
Great. Thank you.
Do you guys want questions as they arise or at the end?
Why don't you let me go through
Yeah.
the basics, and then we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll never get there. So I put on your desk a one-page front and back sheet with this direction, so you don't have to read it on 3 slides. But basically, this direction is what the consultant heard from the joint meeting with the city and county councils. Basically, it would be no new overnight lodging removed from all zone districts as a principal use or a permitted use. And then consider the creation of overlay districts in various locations for the city and county to consider allowing overnight accommodations if they meet certain criteria, and that overlay district would have to be designated via a process that's similar to a rezone. So what the overlay would do is it says, we would consider that in these overlay areas, and then property owners would have to come in and ask for the overlay to be able to be used for specific properties. And that would be an action that the city council would have to take. We call it legislative action because it's kind of like a zone change. And then the overlay would have various criteria and performance standards that would then be administrative and go through the Planning Commission and possibly the City Council. So consider creating these overlay districts, and Landmark has drafted kind of the first cut at those. Oh, sorry. Existing overnight accommodations, this is an important piece, and there are some options. No new overnight overnight accommodations to be granted. So no new builds or residential conversions, and all existing uses would become legal non-conforming uses. That's an option. Option 2 is no new overnight accommodations as principal uses, but they would have to go through the overlay process. And then 3 is the same as 2. And number 2 and 3 would allow existing known overnight accommodation projects to continue without necessarily having to go through the overlay process. That's something that we can figure out, but there's definitely discussion about sort of grandfathering those. They could be, it could be that they would be non-conforming uses, or they could apply for the overlay zone, or we could do some kind of a zoning designation that basically says, these are already approved and they're not non-conforming uses. And the advantage to that is that if something is a non-conforming use, that means they've been operating it as a nightly rental. And if an owner decides they want to live there for over a year, or they want to rent it monthly for over a year, if there's not overnight accommodation rental in a 12-month period, then they lose their right to them. So that's something that you can talk about. If we do some kind of a zoning designation, then that right to use them as overnight accommodations would be maintained, and they could also use them for monthly rentals or ownership or whatever they want to do. This is additional direction. There was discussion about redevelopment of existing uses, whether they're in an overlay or not. I think at this point, that's probably in the second phase of things to really deal with. There's also been a fair amount of discussion about addressing redevelopment, especially in the downtown area. And then discussion about the county council will need to discuss what they want to do on 191, and they're having similar meetings. And then the city and county councils are supportive of a community node concept, which would be a follow-up concept that I mentioned before. So you have neighborhood scale mixed-use development with commercial that's oriented toward the community itself rather than necessarily tourism. So overlay districts. I'm going to talk, there's really a lot of confusion about it, so I'm going to give you a little brief history. Basically, an overlay district, as this says, is established to provide standards addressing unique circumstances or conditions affecting single sites or areas where the development of such sites is of special public concern. They're really common. They're fairly commonly used. I've worked in lots of places that have overlay districts. Basically, the base district stays the same. So things like overall, building height and setbacks and those kinds of things are what they are. But if they're in an overlay district, there may be additional, more restrictive regulations that apply. So all the base density, all the base regulations apply, and there's another layer that may be more restrictive or at least more specific. So the underlying zoning doesn't change, so you'd still have RC where you have RC, and then if you got the overlay zone, you would have to ask for it to be applied to a specific property, and then you could develop that property and it would have to comply with the additional requirements of the overlay zone. That's basically what that says. So there are 3 potential overlay districts that the consultant has been looking at and drafting. The Moab North Gateway Overnight Accommodations Area District, which is the area north of downtown. Downtown Moab Overnight Accommodations, which downtown's a little bit different in character, so it would be looked at slightly differently. And then the Moab South Overnight Accommodations, which is for those areas in the county south of town. As I mentioned, we have drafts of those districts, but we just got them 2 days ago, and I don't expect you to have looked at them in any detail. So we'll certainly need to look at those. And what I'd like is by next Friday for you to take a look at them, and if you have any, if we decide to go with overlay districts, if you have ideas, questions, and we can discuss those at the next meeting. So this is the map, and I know it's really hard to see. I gave you all a hard copy of it, and again, this will be available on the project website. You can see the red in the north is the North Gateway. The purple is the downtown, and then the blue is the south overlay area, which is primarily in the county, And
USCO.
yes. And so we may, also on this map are the little areas that may be appropriate for these little community nodes that we have talked about. So after I'm done with the presentation, you may want to kind of dig in deep to this map if you decide overlays is something that you want to look at. So the overlay options and what we'll want direction from you all tonight is, do we create the overlays and then not use them anywhere at this time while we develop some other let overnight lodging kind of catch up and see where we are once the projects the vested projects move forward. We could create the overlays and apply them to areas designated on the preferred alternative, which is that map I just showed. You could reconfigure or reduce those areas that are designated as overlay, or you can not create the overlay districts if you wish and just let things move forward with things that are in the pipeline right now, or other options, but those are the primary ones on overlay districts. So existing overnight accommodations, I already went through this. I think it's important for us to recognize that those existing accommodations exist, and they're a property right that is in their bundle of property rights right now, and we need to address them somehow. Certainly projects that were built intended for overnight accommodations that somehow look at allowing a continuation of that use without necessarily being non-conforming use, or if you want them to be a non-conforming use, that's an option as well. But it's something that I think we do need to talk about at some point. We don't have to, certainly today, talk about the specific parcels or even the mechanism. What I'm really looking for is just direction about, do you want to make them non-conforming or not, or do you want to designate them so they don't, so that they understand that those rights continue to go with the property. I know Allison mentioned trying to look at something about when an ownership changes, maybe the licenses would then go away. I don't know the legality of that, but it's something that we could look into if you wish. And then there is a map. This is a map that was actually produced by Landmark, kind of a first cut at the existing overnight accommodations in the area. And it does not include Lionsback. So at some point, we'll need to, when we decide what direction to go, we'll kind of need to look at this map in more detail. Uh-oh, sorry. It's yelling at me. So, at the end of this meeting, what it would be nice to achieve is to get some policy direction, get some direction on whether you generally agree with this policy direction, which is what Landmark has used as their kind of marketing orders, whether you're interested in overlay districts, and if you are, do you want to apply any now? Do you want to not apply any? If so, where? And then direction on existing overnight accommodations. So that's my presentation. If you want to, it's up to you guys.
So I think what we should do first is ask and answer any questions that we have, and then we'll see if we can't come up with an agreement on policy direction, number one. So.
I have a question, Nora. Oh. Caitlin, go first.
So I'm a little unclear. With the overlays, is the downtown edge considered part of the downtown overlay, or would that be a different overlay? Because it seems like on the mapping, the downtown edge and downtown are identified as two different areas, and yet.
I would assume, well, there's only one overlay that is proposed right now. I think one of those follow-up tasks would probably be to look at the edge and see if we need to adjust the zoning in those areas to provide a transition.
Okay, because the way the overlay ordinance was written for downtown, it almost sounded more like it was addressing the downtown edge to me than actual downtown core, but it sounds like we need clarification.
Okay. I don't know. We'll have to talk to Landmark about that.
Nora, I didn't know, do we have numbers that break down out of the, 3,800, I don't have the exact number in front of me, existing overnight lodging units that we have, how many are in the city versus the county? I don't know that, it seemed like all the numbers I saw were kind of grouped, but I didn't know.
They are.
Yeah.
The county has pretty good numbers. We have not done that
Yeah.
exercise. So it's an approximation based on good numbers for the county, and I mean, we went back through and tried to look at the number of licenses we have and those kinds of things, but we have not, the city has not gone through the exercise of actually calculating what we have.
I have a couple of questions. In the presentation, just really quickly, you had mentioned future licensing versus like future permit to build. So I just thought that that was interesting language. I would assume that, I thought that was interesting language. I don't know where it was.
And that would be language that Landmark came up with.
Here it is, I think. No, next one.
I think it was under.
There.
All new overnight rental licenses are granted. So it's licenses?
Well,
So there is a distinction between getting a license and getting a building permit.
yeah, now this applies to existing.
Existing.
So you wouldn't be getting a building permit because they already exist. So this, when you have a unit and you want to do overnight rentals, you have to get basically a business license. And so that we can track where they are, and you can, that there's the businesses we know that are running in town, we keep track of those. And so.
So this language to me means that if you own a property currently that's in a nightly rental zone, you can, up until the end of the moratorium, get a license. But after the moratorium ends, and if option 1 were to be enacted, you could no longer get a license. Is that why that
Yes.
language was chosen?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second question was the overlays. The whole point of the overlay is if we were to be still considering overnight rental use.
Correct.
So if we're not considering an overnight rental use in an area, then the overlay doesn't matter. So the overlay is specifically if we want to keep overnight rental use in a particular area, correct?
New overnight
Correct.
rental use.
So the overlay kind of explains what the makeup of that would look like. It's all about overnight rental, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that was it for me. Those were my questions.
And I think that's one of the decisions I think that we would need to come to first is whether or not we as a you as a council, because you guys make the decisions, whether or not we want to eliminate overnight rentals from our city code.
As a use by right,
Yes.
yes. New
As a
overnight
permitted
rentals.
use.
As a use.
As a
Yeah.
permitted use. That's the big one. And from there, we can decide whether or not we want to open the back door to overlay districts or not. But for me, if we close that front door to overnight accommodations in our code, then that's the decision.
Well, and that is number 1, isn't it?
That's right. And I think before we go anywhere else, we need to make a decision on that.
And, you know, whether or not you want to apply them now, I mean, you may want to say, let's wait and see before we apply these, but you could create the zone districts so that we have them in the future. And the reason that we asked the consultant to move forward with that is that they're good at that. You know, that's kind of one of their pieces of expertise.
And that's great, except
Right.
that we are under the crunch to get any city code changed that we need to get changed. And I think if we decide, you guys who get paid to do this, decide to eliminate overnight rentals from the city code, then that needs to be our one and only focus.
Yes.
We can do the overlay districts and we can do anything else later after the moratorium, but we have to get this done if we're going to get it done.
Yes.
I think it's also really, really important to address existing overnight rentals before the end of the moratorium so it doesn't devastate hundreds of people.
And speaking for myself, I can't imagine that we as a city would want to make any existing overnight rentals illegal.
But there are people that don't currently rent by the night, and that's where the issue is with some of these existing developments, where it'd be nice to have something to kind of uniformly protect all of them. People have invested in good faith their savings accounts, their IRAs to purchase these properties. So I think it needs to be heavily considered before the end of the moratorium.
I agree.
Well, that was one reason why I wanted to specify the language about license versus permit to build, because it is important to recognize that right now, or under the moratorium, if you have a parcel, if you have a building and you've never done a nightly rental at that unit, for that unit, you can right now come into Moab City and get a license to operate it as an overnight rental. And I know that you're going past that, but it is important to at least mention that so that we're all on the same page about that the city has said if you own a unit and it is in an overnight rental zone or zone that allows for overnight rental, and you have not gotten come in to get a business license, you can do so, and it can be vested while under the moratorium. And so if we're going forward with option 1, property owners that have buildings should, it's important for them to be aware that, that.
You can get a business license right now.
Yes, and that investment can be secured in that way.
So what I will say to that is that some people don't have any intention of renting right now, and they don't feel like it's being honest to come in and get a business license, you know, when they don't plan to do it right now. They're, you know, they may be planning to live in their place for a couple more years before they retire and hit the road and rent it when they're not here, whatever their plans are. So I don't think we should encourage people to come get a business license when that's not really their intention. And the second thing is, it causes a lot of problems with lending when you're not a conforming permitted use. If you take that away from people, it can cause a lot of problems getting loans or refinancing their properties when they go to sell. So something to be aware of.
So I have a question. So right now, if you are someone who owns a property that could be an overnight rental, but you're not overnight renting it, maybe with the intent to do that in the future to leave that option open, you are not paying a business license fee to the city. The city is not getting anything from that property, and yet it seems like there is the intent or the discussion about having a specific carve-out for a particular subset of property owners with everything that we're talking about here that would not apply to people who bought land with the intent to build a hotel there, and that's their economic investment. But we are potentially talking about allowing that to someone just because they're a different category of person. I guess I'm wondering what is the investment we need to protect with one group of property owners that we don't need to protect with another group of property owners? And, you know, I'd like to say, you know, what is that interest that we're looking at? Why is it important to, you know, protect the person who might rent out their condo as an overnight rental? You know, more so than someone who bought property intending to develop a hotel there later on. And if we are, which it seems the intent of, by and large, the public, is that we don't want more overnight accommodations than we have now, period. How that shakes out property owner to property owner might be different, but, you know, we really need to think about if we're making specific carve-outs, why? What is that interest we're protecting? And really, is it the purview of regulation to protect some people's economic interests but not others? And that's, I understand the discussion, I understand people's savings in their IRA, but at the end of the day, city regulation is allowed to change zoning and change uses in a way that takes a certain economic potential away from it, but not all. And that's what we're looking at here with these regulations, with taking out as a use by right.
And just as a point of clarification, regardless of what happens with this and existing rentals, you still have to come in every year and get your nightly rental business. It's just a matter of where we're going to say they're okay and where we're not.
Yeah. I guess I'm concerned with some sort of, for lack of a better way to put it, have your cake and eat it too situation with someone who owns a property that maybe they're living in now, but they bought it thinking maybe they'd rent it as an overnight rental in the future. But right now, they aren't paying anything or doing anything or putting in any economic investment, payment to the city, permit, license, in order to keep that potential on the property. And I'm wondering if maybe they're, like Emily said, you know, if you have one of those, you could get a business license and to keep that window open, essentially. You know, I'm concerned about the idea that we might be having a specific provision that just applies to one sort of class of people for no other reason other than there's a lot of, you know, input by those particular people when maybe, I don't know that that's something we need to do.
And I think there are two different classes there. I think there are the people that have an overnight rental that are using it as an overnight rental
Yes.
and would like to continue that. And those people who maybe not have a property, I don't know what I want to do, but here I am. That second group will add to our overnight rental properties.
Yes.
Right.
First group does not.
Right.
And I don't know
That's the
that it's the
difference.
purview of regulators to protect people's investment. Their particular, very specific investment, not investment general. It's not taking away all economic viability of a property. But, you know, we have to draw the line somewhere, and, you know, I want to figure out a way where we can protect, you know, we don't want someone to tomorrow who's renting today not be able to do it tomorrow. That's just not how the law works. That's not how regulation works. And that's why grandfathered uses are a thing. But also, do we want to jump through extra hoops as a city and potentially leave some back doors open that we don't intend by having, something continue as of right in any way without oversight?
And that's why I think that decision has to be made as to whether council wants to add or delete overnight accommodations from our city code. It's a line in the sand, and we go one way or the other, for me, anyway.
Yes, I'm happy to go back to that. I do, and, happy to discuss this more later, but it seems like that has to come first. One of a few of the questions that I've had along these lines that we haven't had a chance to discuss with as a group are, let's just play devil's advocate. So say that you decide to do that, and you decide, okay, we've got these vested projects in the pipeline. We want to, say, we're cutting it off at this point for a little while to see where we're at and just see, what's going to happen with those. So the next question becomes for me, do we envision part of this process being just writing that into our ordinance, or do we envision then looking at the zones where lodging is currently allowed and looking at the other currently allowed uses and saying to ourselves, well, if I have this lot in one of these zones and I want to develop it, maybe I wanted to do a hotel, but let's look at my other options. And, I would think if it was my lot, I'm probably looking at, what's profitable. So what are the next 2 or 3 uses that are going to be most profitable? I'm going to guess restaurants are high up there. But I kind of, to feel more informed as a council member, would like to identify what those are and know, is it part of our vision for this ordinance that we're just looking at, say we end up, the whole community probably agrees, we'd like to see more restaurants, but are we creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where all of a sudden, we have umpteen restaurants and we wish that we had some code where we envisioned a little bit better what we wanted these restaurants to look like? Or, so what I'm just trying to figure out if the group is looking to go the next step and look at what those uses would be and make any alterations to those zones, what else we allow now, or I'm just trying to figure out expectations. And then I think one of my other questions was, well, it'll come to kind of reconstruction, because I wasn't sure to me if it was the group's desire coming away from this to know, if I have an existing overnight lodging establishment and I, whether I want to give it a facelift or I want to make some changes. We know we have to discuss, what's going to be allowed. But I needed a better understanding, is that going to happen under our code as it is now, or are there potentially going to be upgraded expectations? I think those were 2 of the main things I had in mind. And then also, I'm just trying to be very aware. I'm very aware of market economics and the idea that I think a lot of us agree that we have enough overnight lodging, but we're also understand, the minute you start building more, you could argue that the price might go up and possibly Moab becomes a more expensive place for people to stay. Maybe not, but if there are fewer units, you would think people would raise prices. But I also think we have enough other spider issues coming off all of this that if market economics was going to take care of us for this, it would have done it. So we know that's not working. So I'm okay to go down that road, but I just wanted to tell everyone I realize that may be one offshoot of what we're dealing with. But yeah.
I want to mention too that if, back to what I was saying about getting the license now, I understand too that it's not just getting a license, but it's also recognizing that that would lead to the property tax change, where then you're paying the commercial property tax instead of residential, and that is more money. So it's good to recognize that. So if somebody is living in a home where it's their primary residence, and they intend to continue to use it as their primary residence, but we're asking them to get a business license, it's going to lead to them getting also probably a change in occupancy, a change in commercial, which would be a higher tax.
Yeah. I think it makes sense to create some kind of fluid you know, this is what's allowed in this subdivision rather than this unit can, this unit can't, this unit can't, this unit can. You know, that's gonna be confusing and people are gonna be renting illegally because they think they can, or it just makes more sense to make it uniform for these subdivisions where it's always been the understanding that you can do that and people have invested in Moab and enjoy coming here and using their unit. So I don't see the harm in allowing them to go back and forth from commercial and residential because that's what they're used for. It's great. We have some long-term, some short-term, or sometimes they flip and go the other way. I think it would create less confusion.
I still think it sounds, at least, you know, to the public who has been, by and large, so supportive of ending overnight rentals, period, all new, anything that's a new overnight rental, that is a, you know, able to, for a while, just say you're not doing it and then not pay as much to have it as a business, not pay to have a license, and then have to still do that. I mean, real estate is speculative. It's a speculative venture like so many other things. And just like any property owner, you have uncertainty in it. And I'm still trying to understand why there is such a need to protect someone's ability to go back and forth with the use of their property rather than just deciding that now when they could do that before August feasibly, whether or not they want to do that. But you have to give something to get something. And I feel like that situation, at least the way it's proposed now, and I think there's probably room for other solutions that could be come to between some of the options. But it sounds like why is the city or the county or whomever in the business of protecting someone's ability to flip back and forth on their property? Why should that be the city's job when we have been told by, you know, members of the community that they do not want any new overnight rentals, period? And I want to figure out a way to address that, but at the same time, like, we really do need to draw that line somewhere. And it's speculative, you know? I mean, it really is. Yeah, you know, you're not paying taxes, but you can still have that higher use of the property. I mean, that just doesn't seem, it doesn't seem fair. It really doesn't seem fair.
I do have an interesting thought, though, on that, and I agree with you on that. But if somebody, I don't know exactly the date or the time this happened, but there was, I'd say, let's see, Jenny's 16, so I would say probably 10 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, or whenever, when literally this town exploded. And I don't know I don't know the exact time, I don't know the exact date. But could we do it, and this is just something I'm throwing out here. When most people in this community are middle class that have lived here for a while. They're not millionaires. There's a couple millionaires, there's a couple trust funders, we totally get that. But most of the people that have overnight rentals or a condo or want to go flipping back and forth are middle class people just trying to make it, you guys, and we all know that, okay? At least I do. Is there anything that we can do to do that kind of cutoff at a time stamp? Let's say everything from 1995 back. This is just a thought, I'm just throwing this out. Everything from 1995 or 2000 back, everything's grandfathered. If you had an overnight rental but you also wanted to live in there because you have kids that are going to college and you want to have them someplace to live, they're grandfathered. But I'm saying from 2000 up, you can't have overnight rentals and you can't have your cake and eat it too. I know that sounds really, I'm putting it out there. I don't say I'm agreeing with it. I'm just putting it out there. I'm just saying.
For context, 2008
was
the downturn. 2013 was the Mighty Five campaign.
Exactly. So I know that sounds, but I'm just throwing an idea out there.
So
I don't have any short-term properties. I have kids in this town. I totally get it. But if there has to be a point where you can be grandfathered, and when you can't be grandfathered.
And I think that point is August. I think you can apply for the business license or you can't.
Yeah, so I think my main concern with that sort of that special carve out is that, you know, if we are talking about allowing future overnight rentals through overlaid districts in other parts, in other properties that aren't the C2 or condos, things like that, the city and the community are getting something out of those allowances. And I would like there to be some way, if we are allowing someone who has a condo in Williams Way, for example, who's not renting it right now, but who still wants to maintain their right to rent it in the future, I want the community to get something out of that allowance, because I think we as a city, as a county, have a right to cut it off completely if you're not a grandfathered use. And so, you know, say use by right was removed in those districts, but there is an overlay if they want to switch from long-term residence to nightly rental, but, you know, say their overnight rental was unavailable for the year, if they decided to come stay in the town for a year or let their friend use it or something like that, it wouldn't jeopardize that status as long as they paid the taxes and fees associated with the short-term rental property in the interim. I feel like there's a compromise there that can happen where we're not giving everything without getting anything back for the community, which has said that they don't want this to happen. I don't know how we would work that in, but I feel like there has to be some sort of mid-ground where it isn't just this blanket allowance. You know, I understand we all have investments. I'm a property owner as well, and the market could tank tomorrow. It's like stocks, you know, you pay someone to maintain your portfolio and what have you, and it's a risk. But I feel like there's some mid-ground that we can come to that doesn't feel like people sitting listening to this meeting who aren't a real estate or a developer economically interested is gonna think, well, how come that gets to happen there and not these other places? You know, is there some way you could have something that you have to do in order to maintain that use other than just be in that zone or be in one of those developments? Is that something that we could do or that city council could do where,
So,
I mean, if they were using it as a rental, decided to not use it for a year, which normally would kick you out of grandfathered status, there could be something that you could do to maintain your right to go back to it at some point.
It's the business license.
I would say the business
yeah.
license does that.
So
$15?
continuing to do that.
So it's
yeah.
a $15 business license, correct?
I think it's 50, but you also have to
50?
file quarterly transient and sales tax, and if you're not generating any, you know, that's,
Then you just wouldn't
well,
file.
you just aren't generating any.
But
But
you
I
have
do
to
want to say that
rent
the
one
city,
day.
I mean, I don't want to ignore the fact that the city does get something out of overnight rentals, and
Yeah.
that's TRT. And our whole tax-based system is based on sales tax. We don't have a property tax. So, I mean,
Right.
I don't want to dismiss that we're not getting anything by people having overnight
No, that's what I
accommodations.
mean, but if we are allowing someone to not have an overnight accommodation currently, but still have that option available, we're not getting something out of it.
it might
No,
be a
we're-
long-term
no,
option
but
for
we
someone that lives
We have
here.
somebody living there long-term, and
Yeah,
I mean, that's also a benefit, so, I mean, we're saying we don't have housing, if it does go into a long-term rental pool, all the better.
and that's what I'm saying. I feel like there has to be some sort of compromise where by leaving that door open for someone to get a certain economic use out of their property, when otherwise the city or the county could just cut that off legally, as long as, you know, and then it would be up to that person to maintain grandfathered status, that there should be a way where it's not completely a win for one side of that equation and not for the community.
I think this is all good conversation. I just want to respect Chair Brown's request that we
Yeah.
address the initial question, certainly as council members, and I assume maybe the Planning Commission wants to chime in too about the initial question of which of Landmark's options we're interested in. So I will just kick us off by saying I'm completely in favor of option 5 for numerous reasons, but number 1, because I feel like as an elected representative, that is representative of the bulk of input that I've received from community members after looking at the list of vested projects and the amount coming at us of projects that we didn't have as much of an opportunity, you know, to mold in a different direction. And issues that other people have raised having to do with the pressures on us in terms of water and traffic and housing, I think it would be beneficial to us to have a bit of a breather, and then we can use this time after the break of the moratorium deadline to work on these other issues. I mean, I think the process has raised great issues, and we can move forward now doing some planning for other tools that people would love to have. But I personally can't see justifying additional units at this point in terms of that larger question of option 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm
Ronnie,
fully in
it
favor
looks
of
like
option
it's
5,
option
or whatever
one.
it's being called
option-
now.
Well, there's only 3.
Oh, that's for the existing
Let me,
uses.
yeah, that's for the existing.
This is just of the,
Oh, okay.
So-
whether or not
I
to
didn't go
immediately
back
apply
and-
an overlay or
I
things
didn't
like
go
that.
back and repeat all the 5 alternatives that we talked about at that meeting. I didn't want to get too confused.
Do you prefer me to refer to?
Option 5 being no growth
No.
other than what's already
Yeah.
in the pipeline when it comes to
No
overnight
new
rentals.
nightly rental.
Right, so
Except
number
for that
one.
38%.
No overlay being designated at
And I
this
say
time.
we
So,
still,
no, let's.
we
so
still go
how
on and
about-
have this
let's go
conversation
back-
about reconstruction.
Let's go back to
and-
number one. Number one says new overnight lodging is removed from all zone districts
Yes.
as a principal use. And I think what we might do at this point, unless council has any other comments for us, is give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or a straw poll, or however we want to do that, so that we can make a decision on number one and then move forward with all the other things that that may lead to. So council? And again, I'll repeat that. Number one says new overnight lodging is removed from all zone districts as a principal use. Council?
Thumbs up or thumbs down? Is that how would you like it?
Well,
That'd be
no,
great.
as a council member, that is, I agree with Ronnie. That's what I have heard. And as a representative, that's what I feel like I have to represent. My only question in doing that is if we remove that as a use by right, where does our power end? What else can be removed as a use by right? When we decide, do we have too many ice cream stores? Do we have, I mean, it can be anything, absolutely anything. So that is my only, no more overnight rentals is what I'm hearing people want. But that's the one really slippery slope that I can see is, do you come to me someday and say, you can't have a barber shop on Center Street anymore?
But again, that's why we have elected officials, and that's why we
I
have
know.
public hearings, and
Yeah, I
that's
know.
why these
And what I
things have
keep
to
in
go through
mind
the
is that-
democratic process.
The next people after us could just totally reverse this,
Exactly.
right?
They
Or
could.
yeah, decide no bike shops or no.
So I've got 2 thumbs up.
So I'm in favor of option 5, but as the foundation for more nuanced additional development. My understanding is that option 5 is the precursor to option 4 or other ones. So I'm still interested in working on option 4 and potentially option 4 with a downtown element. But I feel like we need to remove the use by right for the overlays to work, if my understanding is correct. So I feel like it's option 5 and.
Okay, so option 5 should be our first priority, especially as a planning commission. We need to start working on removing overnight lodging, overnight accommodations from the 7 zones that it's in.
Yes.
It's a lot of work to get all
I mean,
those
we
out
haven't
of there
heard
and
from
do it
Karen, I
correctly.
guess. I mean, Mike's off playing with the bears in Alaska, but I don't know if Karen has anything.
She gave me a thumbs up.
She was thumbs up.
Yeah. So I think that's our first priority, is first have the city staff and the planning commission remove overnight rentals from current county code, city code. And then from there, we can take a deep breath, because we no longer have to worry about the moratorium. We can work on all of the other things that we feel will come from that, whether it's trying to grandfather people in, or whether it's trying to open up the back door for overlays, or whether it's trying to redesign what we have already. I think that's where our direction should be.
I'm sorry.
Karen?
So I would also really like, I mean, we're paying Landmark Design quite a bit of money, and I want to get the most out of our money. And so supposedly they're pretty great with setting standards and I would still like to have that done so that we can have something to go back to.
Right.
Yes.
And we do need to address some nuance. that is outlined in your direction document, like existing development / redevelopment.
Correct.
So should we go through this at this point now that number 1 is
Checked off.
check?
I would like to switch 3 and 2. I feel like our discussion, it's certainly where it started. We need to talk about existing uses before we need to talk about an overlay zone.
Can I just recap on my question really quick, only because I didn't really get a chance to ask all of you. So, I mean, if the majority of people or if everyone is in favor of 5, for lack of another word right now, it does still lead to my question of, what development pressures does that put on other existing uses in those zones where lodging is now allowed? And I mean, it is something that I would feel I was overlooking at some point, and we don't have to figure it out now, but I'm trying to figure out, is that something that the group anticipated looking at before the end of the moratorium or expects to look at after?
No, but that's
Yeah.
certainly something that we as a planning commission can take direction from council. And if council decides that we need to look at how the restaurants are distributed or how the business offices are going or whatever it is, those are things that the planning commission and city staff can take care of with direction from council.
I mean, do you guys understand what I'm saying? I'm just thinking probably on August, whatever it is, when this ends, like if I have a lot, maybe not, but maybe I want to suggest something when the moratorium ends and I'm like, I can't do lodging anymore, so what are my options? And, I pick something that looks good to me, but maybe we get nothing when the moratorium ends, but maybe we get 20 applications for, something else. I don't think it'll be bounce houses, but we'll just, because I like silly examples, we'll choose that. But so I'm just trying to anticipate, like, are there, are there other
Like a
things I need to
bananas?
have planned about?
Since you said bounce house, a bananas.
Yeah. Or
And that's-
Is there a zone for bananas?
outdoor whibbits or something, yeah.
And that's certainly something that we can set as a top priority for the planning commission to start reviewing that code with city staff.
And that may just be the way my tweaky brain works. Like, I don't know if anyone else anticipates that as something one should prepare for if one's trying to do the legwork of long-term planning for directions we might be headed in next as a community. Sorry, Kaya, you were trying to reverse 3 and 2. Go forth.
No, I
Yeah.
was just looking because it seemed like there was a lot here and certainly based on the makeup of the audience, I think discussing what happens with existing overnight rentals should be our next sort of what's our feeling kind of thing.
So then does that lead us to the 3 options that are listed under number 3?
Yes.
Nora, I have a question for you. If something is grandfathered and a lender calls you and says, if this structure burns down, can I rebuild it? What would your answer be?
You would have to follow the non-conforming use section of the code, which,
I don't know that your microphone is on. Your battery might have died.
I think my battery's
Maybe, can that reach over? Brian's reach over.
I'll just.
We also have the
scoot
handheld
over.
shimmy.
And I am not that familiar right now with the non-conforming use section. Usually what happens is you can replace the existing
Like to
footprint,
join?
but if you
Why
want
don't
to
you take a
make.
seat next to Nora, if that works?
Oh, yeah, please.
I'll never get out of here. If I stand right here, I have a chance.
Yeah, you're in.
Joel's in his informal outfit, so he doesn't want to sit at the front.
I also am underdressed for a meeting of this nature. Joel, city manager, might have,
So to answer the question of if it burned down,
yes.
a vested protected use would be allowed to be rebuilt in that scenario because as long as they don't expand it.
Right.
So anytime that there is a vested grandfather protected right, that would be allowed to continue in that scenario, so long as the footprint wasn't expanded, it didn't expand out to 2 uses, but as long as they brought back the exact same use legally, it would be completely protected.
Yeah.
You had mentioned something about lenders looking at zone. I'm not sure that I ever, back in the day, took a hard look at zones. What I looked at was appraisals that had comparisons. And so I feel like it would be on the appraiser to look for comparables.
Yeah, that's a totally different
And that where it would
Evaluation-wise.
affect, but where it would affect your loan is that if it wasn't your primary residence, then you're set to different lending guidelines, like,
No, that's just the type of loan you're getting or possibly your appraised value. They
Yeah.
consider, is this use permitted in this zone? You know, if this structure burns down, can it be rebuilt? Which it sounds like it can. But they don't like grandfathered product. You know, if somebody's buying an investment property and they plan to rent it or whatever, they consider that. I had a conversation with a lender about it this morning. They don't like it. They don't like lending on grandfathered terms.
but the answer would be that it is vested and permitted.
It's vested in.
It just depends on their underwriting and how they're gonna decide if it's too
But
big of a
again,
risk or not.
we as a city planning commission and a city council are not here to protect people's investments.
We're
I
here
would-
to
I would
protect the
assume that
public. I mean, these people in good faith have invested in our community.
I would assume that a letter
I'm
from the
sorry about
city
that.
identifying the vested would be sufficient
That-
for underwriting.
What were you saying, Allison?
That came out wrong. Sorry for that.
It's okay.
But I don't think it's I'll probably trip over myself again here. It's probably not the city's business whether or not I get approved for a loan or not.
Correct.
Correct.
I'm just talking about keeping things simple. You know, these subdivisions are primarily used for one particular use. People do enjoy going back and forth from residential to commercial, so I don't understand why to make it more complicated. Why not just help these people out and let it be fluid and make sense and not be confusing from one
Let's
place
be
to the next?
specific about these people, though. You're specifically talking about the C2 zone, correct?
Mainly like the bigger subdivisions, you know, like Cottonwoods on Williams Way, Entrada, you know, out in Spanish Valley, which this is county, but all those subdivisions, I know they're considering doing that, you know, protecting them with an overlay, expanding their current overlay to reduce confusion and cause panic. I mean, if people don't feel like it's an honest thing to do to come in and get a business license because they're not going to do a nightly rental, they're not going to come get a business license, and at the end of the moratorium, you've devalued their property $100,000 to $150,000, which, why do we want to do that to people?
But they
We
do
don't
that on the
have to.
state level all the time.
And we don't have to. They can
But
come in and
the-
apply
they-
for a business
But
license.
the thing about it is, on the state
They're
level,
not
they
gonna
do
come in
that,
and
they've
lie.
done that
People
already.
don't want to lie.
Well, it wouldn't be a
It's-
lie
yeah,
to
I
get
just
a
wanna
business,
clarify
it's
from
not
a-
a lie to get a
From a legal
business license.
standpoint, it's not a lie.
No.
No, from
No.
a legal
Protecting
standpoint.
your interests.
Yes,
Yes.
in a legal standpoint, you're not running a business, it's not a lie, you are getting it for the sole purpose of protecting your business.
Yes.
Protecting your right, which is completely allowed.
So
It's
you don't
not.
have to
But-
prove that you're functioning that business?
So that would be as a part of the code you'd be passing, and if the requirement is that you solely have to have an operating business license to protect the permitted use that was allowed, then that was all that would be required.
Yeah.
So I just want to,
So in order to protect your ability to live in your property but sell it at a commercial price when you sell, because that's something we're talking about here too. This is, you know, living in an R zone where you used to be able to have an overnight rental, code changed and you can't anymore. Those people can't sell their houses as an overnight rental price, but we're still talking about a particular group in a particular zone in certain developments that could do that. And so in order to protect your right to sell it for $150,000 more, you pay something towards that. It doesn't just come automatically. I think that's what we're talking about. at least this.
so Becky is saying, what if we propose an overlay where we identify certain parcels and say that overnight lodging is not removed as a use?
Residential, commercial, just like it is. It's a
And-
great zone. People love it.
So,
That's why
but,
it's such a
but what
popular
just
product.
happened was the council said unanimously that they did want overnight lodging removed.
Correct.
That was
New overnight
conditioned on
lodging.
us having this
New
discussion.
overnight lodging.
If option 5 means that we don't have this discussion, then I am not in favor of option 5.
So then.
Option 5
it
is a
sounds like-
precursor to
Yeah.
having this discussion about how we manage.
Okay, so it sounds like there is an overlay that's under consideration, or that you're proposing to be considered, that carves out certain properties that were developed to be nightly rental?
I
And-
believe there are zoning tools that can offer a solution to all of this.
And so the question is to then the council, like, do you want to move forward with that?
Is it, how hard is it to get a little bit more information? I don't know if it helps anyone other than me, because in the end, it probably doesn't matter numerically, but would it be hard to get a list of numbers of how many units we think we're talking about and which
No.
developments and
It's
what
on-
they're being used as now?
It's on the
Just-
table, and I just added it up, and so I can, because I've wanted to know that.
Okay, I
So
mean,
out of
yeah.
4,681 total built residential units,
Kaylin, say that number again, I'm sorry.
4,681, and this is on the table, but it just wasn't parsed in the way that when I'm hearing Ronnie wants to hear. 1,078 of those are potential short-term rentals, like they could potentially be both residential and they're not campgrounds or hotels. And then 156 of those are not yet overnight rentals. So 14% of the potential STRs are not yet, and they're 3% of the total lodging potential.
Are those all city numbers, Kaylin, or combo, city, county?
No, it's the
just so-
combo because it
Yeah.
wasn't broken out
Yeah.
in that table.
So I realize that I would really like to draw a hard line, so why don't we go back to the business permit? That, to me, would hold us to our promise to the community of no new overnight rentals. It would also protect those people who are living in those zones and have those properties. They can come in and spend $50 and protect their investment.
Sounds good.
Can we confirm the
So-
license amount? Do you know offhand? Is that
A
50, Joel?
parallel would be like, let's say you are a trained architect and you want to keep your licensure because you want to still dabble in architecture, but you're otherwise retired. That, I think, is a good parallel.
Have
That's
that
a
for the
totally-
bar
that's a
if you are
totally
not
great-
currently
that's
practicing,
what I
yeah.
have to, that's
So
what
I
have to
I
do.
don't
They're
want,
CTEs.
liar feels like a really
It's not.
emotional word, and I want to be careful because I don't think anyone wants to be called a liar or be a liar. People don't want to be lied to. So
No way misleading.
Right. You're protecting your right.
Protecting your
Joel, so if someone gets a
contractors
business
do
license
that
at
as
their
well. They'll take their
Cottonwood
test, they'll not build a thing, they're not a
townhome.
liar.
and they don't want to rent it by the night, they want to rent it long-term to someone that lives and works in Moab, they can do that, but still keep that business license?
So you ask me again, just so I make sure I understand.
So if someone owns a Cottonwood townhome or an Entrada, and they decide they don't want to run it as a nightly rental, they want to rent it to someone maybe that works in a restaurant or a bike shop, they want to rent it long-term, can they do that and keep their business license?
If the grandfather requirement is solely that they have a business license, yes.
So it's whatever we
Yes.
come up with in
Yes.
this
The
ordinance.
requirement is currently under the county rule, to keep a grandfather right, you have to prove up on it every 6 months, which would mean that currently under that rule, they would have to overnight rent it once every 6 months, which would mean your example would be extremely difficult to do because you're gonna have a hard time finding someone who's gonna wanna sign a lease less than 6 months, so they
Yeah.
can do the overnight. But if that grandfather requirement was changed in order to keep the requirement to be solely business license oriented, it'd be no issue. They would have to never let their business license expire.
Yeah.
That would
Yeah.
be the caveat.
Yes.
Which is also kind of unfortunate, because look at the fellow on Cane Creek with his B&B, you know? I mean, he let his business license lapse and he's in a mess.
He made a choice to
He
come
made
in
a
and change
choice.
it so that he could actualize,
Fully realizing what he was doing.
fully realizing it was explained to him, and he fully realized what he was doing.
He was changing this for the tax value, so his tax structure would change.
There are also other methods besides just the business light method, if you wish. I mean, you don't have to do an overlay. You could, as was mentioned, you can do a zoning designation. You know, you could say it's a C2-N or whatever, and that's identified for parcels that we all know these properties were built to be nightly rentals, like Entrada. And it would then recognize those, and that they could continue to get a business license or not get a business license. So there are a number of different ways to do it, and we can talk further about that.
But Nora, that would be then when we're saying no new overnight lodging is removed, or overnight lodging is removed, then we would have a zone where it's not removed.
Right, that's backdoor.
So
We,
that's
you know,
for this council
we,
to kind of speak up about.
we,
If you
ha-
want.
we can think about this in a equitable way. So we
Could
can.
you speak up, Marianne? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So we can still have a floating district on these C2 zones, such as an overlay district. And one of the conditions of those can be that they have an existing business license, which was purchased before the moratorium is over. And the benefit of that for tax revenue for the city would be that as a condition of applying the overlay district to their property, in an instance like they want to sell it and increase the property value, so they want that floating zone to be applied to their property, they would have certain conditions which would need to be met and paid for, like they would pay into some sort of the conditions of the overnight lodging, accommodations, requirements, like open space dedication, fees in lieu, things like that. They give a little bit more than a business license in order to have the overlay applied and to have their property and value pretty substantially increased before selling it.
And potentially that's something to look at in the future. I'm just really concerned about that August timeline, and I like the idea, but I think kind of what the track we were on with Becky and Joel and Nora, thinking about what's a way that we can make it so grandfathering works for our community in a way that everyone can be happy with. It seemed like we were getting fairly close with this suggestion. I'd love to get back to that if possible.
Ronnie asked if we could clarify what the fees were. That didn't get done.
I don't remember the business licensing fee off the top of my head. It's less than $50. I want to say it's 42.
Oh, that's right, we did have a,
I don't remember.
that's right. That's right.
And then the renewal was much less.
Is it possible
Yeah, I'm confusing county. I thought it was 50.
that
It's actually
for those zones that we're talking about, these where the overnight rentals are allowed right now, is it possible to give people a bit of an extension on when they can get that business license? If the moratorium ends in August, could they have till the end of the year?
Today's May 23.
You could codify
August.
something into your code that you were removing out of that section, and the last ability to protect a permitted use would be, and you could put a date in there.
So we could give them till the end of the year, just so that, okay, it gets messy.
That's what I was going to ask, is
but-
some kind of notice or something so people know.
Is there a way to notify people?
Notice is a scary term, because
I said notify.
I mean, if they're not aware that something's happening yet, and then if the word's not got to them,
Yeah.
that August 12th is a beautiful day, and they need to go get a business license by then, I don't know that extending it and adding more time to that
Makes
to
it
provide more
very
notice
worse.
is, I mean, we've had 6 months of what's happening. I'm not saying it's a
Oh,
bad idea.
fair
You could
enough. No,
absolutely
fair
do it.
enough.
But at what point do you go,
You're done.
Enough.
I'll be honest, I was really confused about the moratorium until about a month ago. I thought it applied to any new business license. So just putting that out there, like, I didn't even fully understand that it was only on new building permits. I thought it was everything across the board.
So
So
can we-
people may not know.
Can we tentatively agree, though, with the idea of a business license for these properties and move forward from there?
I have a question about that. Sorry. So in order to acquire a business license, you have to take several steps to get there, especially if you're going to do new construction or something.
It will not be new constructions.
It will
These
not
are-
be new construction.
These are overnight,
You're
these are
right,
units.
Brian. There
Right.
is a health department check.
Right.
There is a building planning department check, and there is a fire check. So if somebody were to get their business license and say, yes, we're going to operate it as a nightly rental, or have it licensed to do so, they will be held to the standards of those 3 departments in order for them to receive their license.
And maybe that's where our extension comes in. They
You're in the
come in and
pipeline.
apply for a license and have an extension until the year to get all of those things done.
Okay.
your application is your date.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
if you came in on August 9th and filed your application, and it took till September 1st to get those done, August 9th is your date.
Yeah.
Brian, does that help?
Yeah, that does, that helps.
Okay.
He just answered that.
So can we move forward with that idea of a business license covering those folks?
Yeah, and we can certainly flesh that out more.
Okay.
But that's a good direction to start with.
Okay.
Or existing,
Can we just,
existing
can we straw poll the
structures
council?
that,
Can we please straw poll the council?
Well, can
we clarify?
yes.
Sorry, while we're on that, what Nora just said, for existing structures in certain areas. So this wouldn't be an empty lot in the C2.
Right.
This would be
Existing
That's
use.
an
up to
existing, something that you could feasibly, would be ready to have someone rent tomorrow.
The way you just explained how to get your license, August 9th, get your
Yeah.
inspections, obviously you can't have those
Right.
inspections if you
Exactly.
don't have a building.
Yes.
So if someone came in on August 9th and it's a dirt lot and they said, I want to get a business license,
Yeah.
they'd say, well, we need to do inspections. Well, I don't have a business or a
Yeah.
building yet. We'd say, well, you can't get a business.
Just for the public, because I know there are some empty lots in the zones that we've been talking about as where this applies, and I know there are people, we're all cutting out, are really concerned about somehow there being some way to sneak that in. So I just want to make sure that was clear for people.
And then these would become non-conforming uses unless we choose to address it otherwise, right?
Correct. Karen?
And I was gonna just ask, to try to get a temperature on the council, how they felt about having it in the code, that it only is requiring a business license and not the renting it for one day
Right.
out of the year.
And that's something
or-
that we can change in the grandfathering
Change that.
code.
Okay, because I mean, I just, again, I don't, that just creates a subterfuge of dishonesty and.
Right.
And I would rather not
And
go
I think
that
that's an
route.
easy fix.
It's a good word, too. Subterfuge.
Thanks. Thanks.
And I
So-
just want to remind people that everybody listening and watching too, like, I mean, if we do this, this will be us doing this, but we have no guarantee over what the people after us are going to do. This could change again, yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do as a council that another council can't undo, change.
Right.
And that's just-
So can we have a thumbs up or thumbs down from city council on the idea of a business license?
Yeah, that's good.
Option one.
That's only one thumb.
Well, I got one thumb.
Feel better about that
Raise 'em
than
both.
no license. I just need a little more time to think about it, but yes.
Okay.
in general.
I feel like I want our staff to advise us on what the best mechanism is to achieve this.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. And there are different ways to do it. So I understand what you're getting at. And so we'll go back and look at ways that can actually get done.
Joel, in terms of the law about licensing, and I know it's always changing in Utah, do we need like a separate legal opinion on it, or is it pretty cut and dry in terms of this notion?
There is nothing you're going to propose that we're not running through.
Yeah, okay.
Whatever you guys decide here will go through Chris
Okay.
and will quite possibly go through others.
One of my concerns about this is that part of the larger community goal is to have more long-term housing. And if we push people to get business license, then that's one less barrier for them to actually rent it if they're not already.
Unless the business license is $15 or $50.
They still have to go through the work, like they just may not have bothered because.
Say that again, Kaylin, so explain that.
So someone's not overnight renting now, but in order to preserve that aspect of the value of the property, they do need to get a license. And then at the point that they've got a license, like we have notified them, and then they've gone through the process, and then it's like, oh, all they have to do is call this property manager that all my neighbors use, and boom.
I understand that concern, but I truly think that reality is very few and far between, and what we're talking about is much likelier to go the other direction, where someone wants to, they are already overnight rentaling, or they bought the property with that intent, and those are gonna be the people who are interested in taking up on that licensing thing. Like, I understand that, but I don't wanna get sort of false flags in there where that is kind of a boogeyman almost for not taking that kind of action. Whereas if it was the traditional grandfather where, yeah, in order to maintain your use, you have to actually overnight rental it, I would be more concerned about that. But it seems like the compromise we're close to would, I mean, if that's gonna be your push to pushing an overnight rental, like,
And we're not talking everywhere.
yeah,
You know, we're talking primarily
in those
given areas
developments,
in
yeah.
C2.
Right.
Is it,
Sorry.
no, go ahead, Becky.
I just wanted to say I strongly agree with Kaylin. There are a lot of long-term rentals in Rim Village Vistas, Rim Village, Cottonwoods, and if someone's going down the road of, I'm getting a business license, they might not necessarily take the time to read through this whole ordinance and understand that they can still rent it long-term, and they'll probably turn it into a short-term rental. Or like he said, they might just say, oh, what the heck, I'll just do it. And you're kind of steering them in a direction away from what they've been doing. There are a lot of long-term rentals in these subdivisions.
This, and that ties into a question, so with the county, you get a tax break if you are renting it to someone long-term. Would that affect, even if you have a business license, would you still be able to go in if you're renting your unit to a local for a year, can you get your tax break?
I'm not sure, because they typically base that on, like, you can show them the lease and typically get the primary resident. But if you pull a business license, I think it spits you into a different category. And then you're a secondary homeowner, but maybe you could still show them the lease. I don't know. You'd have to ask the assessor.
I mean, because that would be an incentive.
Weren't we going to require all landlords, even
Yeah.
those with
Yep.
long-term rentals, to have a business
I
license?
think we should.
Have a business license either way, and in the
Right.
city, we're not collecting property tax, so.
I
mean,
guess-
get we have to make it align with the county to try and get them to do a comprehensive plan.
I guess,
No, yeah,
Right.
comprehensive.
Well, that's a question for Debbie Swayze. So if somebody were to show Debbie Swayze a long-term, 12-month residential lease, would she honor that as a primary residence rate? That's a question for her.
And that,
And then
and
you've got personal property tax too, which is tied to the business license, so, I mean, I don't know how she's gonna look at that.
That's if you're renting it, though.
It's if you have a business license. Any business has to pay personal property tax.
But if you're not renting it, or if you're renting it just as primary, I mean, you'd be doing that anyway.
yeah,
I don't know.
If
We'd
you're
have to
doing that, you're
clarify
doing
with
that.
her.
I mean, I have a long-term rental in
yeah.
the city, and I'm able to show that I have a long-term rental, and I get the benefit of renting that. I get the tax break, yes, so it
I
seems.
bet she would
I mean,
honor it.
I'm just, also, it's just an incentive, again, for people to get their, to do it right
Yeah.
and get a license. I mean, it's,
well, Joel and Nora, can you think, maybe, and come back, think through the scenario of, so it seems like the beauty for someone, if they get the license for the short-term rental, is that protects their long-term ability to rent it as a short-term rental. But if they, if they're renting it out long-term to a local and they pay, the lesser landlord license, then it seems like in the scenario we're talking about, that doesn't protect their long-term right to change their mind later. So does one ever create, or, how important are these units that are being rented long-term to us, and does one ever create yet another category, but that does maybe do something to help incentivize the long-term rental option?
We would have to look into how to do that.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be through licensing.
Yeah.
We would not be allowed to do that through licensing.
Property taxes are.
We don't do the taxing, but we could look in to see what the benefit is through the county and how they're.
Yeah. Those are all good things to look at, think about.
Do you feel like you have enough direction so we can move on
Yes,
to some of these other
absolutely.
points? Or?
So are we happy with 1 and 3 on our list now?
Uh-oh.
We're content.
Okay. I'm getting used to them anyway. So item number 2 is the city council will consider creation of overlay districts. Do we need to?
In the North US 191 corridor and in downtown.
So I guess
Do you
my
want to
question,
create them at all? And if you do you want to apply them anywhere?
and I think that's my question. I think with the money that we're spending on Landmark, we might as well have them make them. But
I think
for
so.
me, using an overlay district is just closing the front door and opening the back door.
Well, it's just redoing the door.
And we've decided
doesn't
on
have to
number
be
1
a-
that we're closing the door.
And giving the person inside supreme choice over whether to let someone in or not in any situation, right? I mean, that's the idea, because anytime the overlay would be there, but anytime there was something approved under it, it would be a legislative action by city council.
I will say that we went through great lengths to remove conditional use permitting. And that while I definitely would love to have drafted overlays for consideration, it does reopen the conditional use permit pain,
Yes.
Does.
and the pain is real.
And that was one of my questions as a planning commissioner was, if we have an overlay district, how do we say no if they've met all the criteria? How do we say no?
Well, the council would have to make a decision as to whether they want to allow it to be applied to a specific piece of property. And we'd have to come up with some findings that they would have to make in order to make that decision. And then when the project actually gets to the planning commission, then it becomes administrative. Because if they meet all the performance criteria, basically, yeah, they can do it.
Which to me
So
just
then
opens
it's
the door to overnight
administrative,
accommodations.
not legislative. So I think,
Second piece is administrative, not legislative. But the
so
first-
I think
The
what I
first-
would,
Anything planning commission is administrative.
what I'd suggest for us to consider is potentially an overlay that would be administrative. So if we set,
That's illegal.
Overlays
No,
have to
you
be
can't.
Yeah.
zoning has to be legislative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, you have to create the zone legislatively, but you don't have to, you can say this is an overlay zone, and anywhere in here,
you have design criteria, which then gets approved
right,
administratively.
you can apply for overnight accommodations under the conditions that are outlined in the overlay district if you designate one in that area. And so you'd skip that second legislative action where you'd be applying the overlay specifically to a piece of property. So you could say there's an overlay in this area, and then people could come in anywhere in that area
Yes,
and
meet the
apply for
criteria.
basically a site plan review
And have administrative
and have it
approval.
administratively.
And that's my recommendation to you all.
Sorry,
and
Nora,
that's
it was
the way overlays.
hard to follow you. Could you say
Okay.
that again?
So we have been talking about is on the map, we'd have these overlay zones. And what the direction that we've been going is that individual parcels would have to come into the city council and say, I'm in the overlay and I want it specifically applied to my parcel, legislative action, like a rezone. So then they would do it. Once they do that, then they would go through the administrative process with the planning commission of the project itself.
Yes.
The other way to do it, which is the way most overlays work, is it basically is just an additional layer of rules that apply to that overlaid area. So you have all the base zoning stuff, but then you have additional performance criteria, height, bulk, scale. You have all the ordinance provisions that have to be met, and it would automatically, the overlay is already done. So you just go through the process, the administrative process. So you skip that legislative step.
So,
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. It seems the one that Landmark is proposing is the former, however.
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm suggesting go ladder.
Would that still create a use by right by some other name?
Yes.
Yeah, but
The
it's,
concern.
but it's an
Yeah.
overlay, and it's something that could or could not be applied, just like.
If it's administrative, we lose discretion.
Right.
But the discretion is whether or not we would apply an overlay.
And that's where I hope we head, is have Landmark make them and just never apply them, or not apply them at this current time.
Yeah.
can I ask a question? So in this three-step process that is outlined in the ordinance draft, step 2 is application for attaching overnight accommodation overlay to a specific site, property, or development. And then what it addresses, land area to be rezoned and general terms upon which it is approved, including but not limited to the following: proposed primary uses, number of rooms, units, design and development conditions, and it lists others. So this kind of sounds to me like contract zoning. Is that,
Well, I can't call it contract zoning, but it would be.
because it's illegal in Utah?
But it would be, It would be using an overlay and requiring an extra legislative step.
Which is what the county is currently doing with their high-density overlay. So, I mean, there's precedent for it here in Grand County. And they've started that process already. People have applied, they're undergoing that with folks.
And I just want to remind everybody that we already made the decision to remove all overnight rentals from the
Yes.
code. So again, it comes back to me, to the front door and the back door.
Yes.
We've given direction to staff. We haven't made,
Right.
Right. No, I understand, but this is how I'm stewing over here. I'm like, as soon as we apply the overlay districts, we've opened up the door
Yes.
to overnight accommodations.
Yes.
So do people feel like if we were to move forward with having landmark draft overlays, do people feel like we would apply them right away? Or does the majority feel like we're taking a break?
Do you want me to start? I'd like to take a break.
Okay, so it's a later tool,
Yes.
but it's a firm break for you.
Yes.
Kaylin?
I think that there are other community and economic development goals which could be addressed, which we may be able to facilitate the economics of developments that address those with relatively minor additions to our already large inventory of overnight accommodations, and I think that's worth considering. I think the ordinance as drafted does not go nearly far enough in terms of establishing performance standards. I do not see how it's really much different from what we have on the books now, and I think there's a lot of work to be done to get there, and
So like an extreme or like a going further would be like an overlay that allows 10% to be overnight accommodation and 90% or something
as
like
it is,
that.
as I read it now, all it says is like the developer proposed something, and
it looks a certain way,
right? As
maybe.
opposed to like the high
Would-
density housing where there's very specific performance standards, and we know what we're getting
Right.
if it gets applied.
Which
So
seems like a good reason not to apply the overlays right away.
I don't think we're ready, Emily. I mean, that's.
Yeah.
Tony, Ronnie, you agree?
No, I
Same.
don't think we're ready yet, but I think we're foolish if we don't have landmark,
Correct.
at
yeah.
least create them. We're, like Karen says, we're paying them good money. That's what they do. We have the discretion and whether to apply them or not. I mean, that's,
And we don't,
Ronnie?
you can.
Well, let's give Ronnie a chance to.
So, I mean, I'm still trying to understand if there's a different product that one can ask Landmark for, because to say we're not doing anything for a while anyway, while we digest what's happening, I would prefer, if the city's gonna spend money and give it to them, that they work on something that would be, an immediately next usable tool for us, towards these things that we've said have to come next because we need more time beyond August. Like if there's one of those immediate things off, I don't know how long the list is, but if it's 20 things, out of the top 3 or 4, if they could work on one of those, that would make me feel better about having them work on something than to say that we're paying them for something that we're not going to apply, and I don't even know that it would be applicable in 4 or 5 years, because Moab's going to change so much in another 4 or 5 years. And I guess just a side question I have for people, because I wasn't involved in that portion of, drafting these polygons that make up the overlay zones. But so I've kind of been missing the piece of like how and why were these drawn and partitioned the way they are to begin with. So, yeah, so some of us are trying to catch up. Yeah.
Follow up what you're saying
Yeah.
though. What would that work be?
Well, that's kind of my question. Yeah. Yeah.
What's your suggestion?
Mixed use, why not, look to the future, when we do allow the overnight overlay, that you require mixed use with a hotel or lodging or whatever, especially in the RC zone. I mean, those parcels are huge.
So that's
Somebody's
what
not gonna
Kaylin's
buy
saying.
one
Is that
and build
it's
one
the
restaurant.
implication
It's a
of mixed
big
use.
development parcel. Most of them are humongous.
Except I think my vision of mixed use doesn't include, it sticks with this commitment to 5, and it's all about mixed uses that don't include lodging. So maximizing mixed
okay.
use in the existing zones with everything else that's going to be allowed now, like how could they help get us to the next level? You know, whether it's
a little
in
bit
those zones and community nodes too.
a little bit
Yeah.
of form-based code to address the issue of scale and what it's going to look like, the setbacks, where it's going to be. So yeah, to write into, like what Kaylin said, write into existing code what we want our form-based code to look like and what we want those buildings and mixed-use areas to actually look like.
I think
Especially if it could be something that helps with the redevelopment question.
Well, but then
And I'm not a planner, so I
But
don't.
then that base, like, why not just do that everybody instead of just zones? If it's not, if it excludes overnight rental, why not have it apply to
I
every?
think all of what everyone's saying is compatible with Karen, with what she's saying, where the community has said, by and large, they want a break. And I think, you know, the front page of the paper today is 38% is still coming regardless of the moratorium. And that's a number that's been out there in some respect. But I think now that more folks understand that, I think, at least Karen, what you're saying is that, you know, obviously use Landmark's skills and talents to have, you know, and even if it's a couple years down the road, that's a framework, you know, it's not saying we have to take exactly what, or that council has to take exactly what Landmark says and apply that. They can say, okay, here's a good thing, here's what we've noticed in the last couple of years that we might want to tweak out that, but we're not starting from scratch then. If you have them in the bank, basically, to be formatted, reformatted, and used as an outline, but you can still have that break while we see what town feels like when that 38% more is actually built, which it isn't now, right?
And I guess I'm just curious, can their product be flexible? Does it have to rely on the assumption that lodging is a portion of the overlay they're creating, or is it flexible enough
We can make those overlays
that it
any
could
way we
still be
want.
mixed?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know, whether in 5 years people decide, okay, yeah, we want 20% more, or in 5 years people say, okay, no, maybe not, but boy, we still need more mixed stuff. So it's a puzzle piece you can take in or out, or that's
Yeah,
not
and
a
as
good
she said, it's
analogy.
just a framework. We can take whatever Landmark gives us and say, well, let's do this instead of that. Let's change this instead of that. And then eventually, if we apply it, we will have exactly what we wanted.
Can we ask them to include things in that overlay zone? If, like Becky says, the RC zones are huge, can we ask them what housing looks like in those zones?
And I think that's
right
something
now,
that we could come up with a
in the
list.
code, if all city council were to do would be to remove overnight lodging as a use by right, you could build an apartment complex, a multifamily home in the RC zone, which is that north corridor of town, which might be feasible if your property was no longer able to be used as a hotel. I mean, those are things that are in the code right now that you can do, and that applies in all of the zones that we're talking about too. They have at least 2 family houses
Do
available.
they have to be, can they be on the ground floor?
The housing? Yes.
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 They can be,
Yes.
can be on the ground floor.
Yeah. There's no design requirements in that way.
It is in the C3.
Yeah.
I thought you had
You can't do housing on the ground floor in the,
We'll have to,
that's why I was asking, because
You-
I thought there are certain commercial zones where you cannot do housing on the ground floor. So it's already kind of mixed use-ish.
Yeah, you can
But
do,
I'm just making the point of, it's a high-demand product. It would make the likeliness of whatever you want to get built quicker, you know, by allowing some lodging in that mixed use. Short-term lodging.
Short-term lodging.
and then we do have to consider the idea, if we really want these changes in the RC or someplace else that shouldn't be an overlay district, change code.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
You can change what's allowed in the RC zone, and you can also do different mixed-use zones. So you could do a mixed-use zone that anticipates overnight accommodations, and you can do one that doesn't.
And I think that what we need and what staff needs is a direction from council. If council wants to change the RC zone to include more of whatever, we can do that.
To allow housing on the ground floor. Because
Right.
then what that allows is like townhomes, as opposed to like retail and apartment. It allows ownership. If you're not on the ground floor, you can't, it's very difficult to do ownership. You can do condo, but that's complicated. So that's something for considering.
There is no ground floor requirement in the RC as it's written now. You can have, period, multi-household dwellings. there are no design standards for multi-household dwellings.
There's another part of code that specifies design standards.
And we can find those, but
Yeah, but the idea being
Summer?
that, yeah.
I think that
You know?
Landmark should do an overlay zone for the overnight, like the C2 zone. I think they should do something.
They do.
And I think so
Housing on the
too. I
ground
think we
floor
should take
and
advantage
RC
of their skills and have them develop overlay zones for accommodations. But I think the other things that we're beginning to speak of
Can.
need to be code
So it's just
changes in the
C3.
zones that we want them to be. I
Correct.
think there's a difference. There's the overlay zone for overnight accommodations from Landmark. There's code changes to things that we'd like to see or start to develop in other zones. Code changes, overlays.
And then at what point are we gonna look at the map? I mean, because these, the colors are
Right.
all, I mean, basically it's all of town, so.
If you want to apply overlays, you need to look at the map. If you're not ready to do that, then you don't.
Then we can hold off on that.
Yeah, I think that's just more reason for time.
Then we're not gonna have Landmark do it? Is that what we're suggesting?
Well, they've already given us a draft.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the original, just over at the top of all our zoning, right?
Yeah.
This one here?
Yeah.
So I think we're heading in two directions. I think what ideally I'd like to see is what council would like to see in the overlays, if and when we apply them. And then I would like to see what council would like to see as code changes in our current zones that do not apply to overnight rentals. I think they're two different things, and if we want our money out of Landmark, then that first list has to come first. We need to decide what kind of things would we like to see if we eventually apply the overlay.
Well, according to Landmark, when we started going to the steering committee's meetings, they wanted us to pick an overlay first, decide where you want these areas, and then we'll get into the details of form-based code and building standards and all that stuff.
And I think
So-
that's where we are. We're at that point where we need to talk about form-based code.
I understand that that's Landmark's direction. Would that necessarily need to happen, though? Because it sounds like there's a lot of disagreement about what the polygon itself seems to be, right? But I guess why couldn't you have standards that you could then shimmy around the boundaries of where it is however you want, if and when the time comes? I
I
understand
just think it
that.
depends where it is. I mean, depending on where this overlay is, different design standards and requirements would be, appropriate in different areas. Like along the highway on RC is totally different than downtown, and First West or First East or
Yeah.
whatever street, so.
So maybe stick with what sort of the general polygons are now, understanding that at any time,
We
city
can
council
shift them.
could do whatever, pick and choose from some, but have it in a format that already is kind of tied to a particular area.
And just keep in mind that whatever Landmark gives us is a framework.
Right.
We can do whatever we want with it. But if we can give them some direction now, and they can apply those ideas now, then when we start messing with it later, it'll be a lot easier.
I'm just still gonna state that I'm concerned with the RC zone being drawn down as far as it is portrayed right now.
Where would you draw it to?
Where it
Probably
actually is.
where it existed before, where the RC zone,
And then the downtown one would go up to it.
yeah.
And so where the existing one is that Denny's?
Yes.
Fifth West.
And it's one side of the highway and not the other, because C4 extends across at Denny's and then up too.
So can we give that general direction to Landmark? That we feel that the downtown zone should extend up to the intersection of Fifth West and 191? Is that what
Just
everyone's
up
saying?
to where the RC zone actually currently is
everyone-
in our official zoning.
Yeah.
I
Yes,
agree.
on that?
Yeah.
I agree on that, yes.
Well, that's
You're
easy.
talking about, the overlay zone, or,
The
overlay
proposed
zone.
overlay, yeah. So what they're calling on the overnight accommodation preferred alternative north of downtown, it sounds like what Karen and folks are saying is that north of downtown should just be what currently is RC.
And that downtown be both sides and down too.
And so I
but you're
think,
not sure you want to apply those at this point in time?
correct.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so maybe what council can come up with, and this could be an individual project or a workshop, is a wish list of things that they wish to see in the overlay zone for these three areas.
sounds like planning commission work to me.
But we don't want it to be rejected when it gets to city council, so we would like it to come the other way.
I think that's fair.
But remember,
That's fair.
it's just a wish list of things that we would like to see in the overlay zone so that Landmark can develop that. And then so when we get it back, at least those ideas are mixed in there to start.
More than what they have proposed.
Yes.
With sustainability and
Yeah, all that kind of
size.
stuff.
Right,
But they haven't proposed much of anything.
exactly,
Yeah.
Right, right.
A
exactly,
little bit of mass and bulk stuff, but.
yeah.
Kaylin, do you have any ideas on getting more specific there? I mean, I just don't have, I probably have some generalized ideas, but you seem to have a really good
Well-
sense of just how general it is, how far it is from maybe where we
And I know
could
that,
be.
I know that this is an entire workshop for city council, so can we put that off and move on to item number 4?
Yes. We need to,
But I'll just say, if you want to go look at what Durango's done, as far as having zones and architectural standards for different areas, that would be a place to start.
all right, redevelopment, we have to
Okay, so
address.
number 4, city and county councils need to determine how to address redevelopment of existing uses. Nora, can you speak to that just a little bit for us?
I am unclear on that myself.
Okay.
And I'm not sure, given the time frame that we have.
Let me put it this way. If a hotel has 60 units, they're vested. If they came in and applied to do an additional 60 units, do we say yes
No,
to that?
I would hope not.
So then that's answering the addressing redevelopment. Or if somebody had a duplex, nightly rental duplex, could they tear it down and do 4 units where there were 2?
I think that's a whole different
That's a different, that's a
discussion,
different discussion.
which is very important, but
How is it different? It's just addressing what's allowed.
That would be a grandfather issue too, because if you have something that's a non-conforming existing use, there are parameters wherein you can keep it as when it's still the existing use and isn't an expanded or different use.
in my opinion, it's not something that we could easily come up with in 2 weeks. But it's important, there's no doubt about it.
So,
It does say that the default limits on redevelopment is no expansion.
Yeah, I think that's the question. Are we going for the default, or do we want to allow for redevelopment expansion?
I would say if you had enough time to get to the point where you had new standards that introduced mixed use, I would potentially be okay with a larger footprint that included more mixed uses, but in terms of a net increase in number of overnight lodging, I think that's a totally different bear, and that doesn't fit in this option 5.
So that's the direction that you're proposing, is that redevelopment?
That's just me.
Yeah, but that's, how do other people feel?
I'm going to go out on a limb and agree with that.
It's a thin limb, Kaylin. There's also already one bear and one person who eats a lot of Ben and Jerry's. It might break.
could that be something that Landmark was given as something to look at as well? So say you have a box chain hotel that decides that it is very ugly and outdated and wants to update, but also, again, that whole getting something for giving something that it seems like, we're trying to do in code more, get something for the community if they are allowed to redevelop, but then they can, put mixed use if they make the first floor retail or office space or what have you. Like, those seem like things that it would be great to have Landmark propose how that would work. Say you're a 150-room Marriott or whatever, and you want to, I don't know what the proposal would be to some sort of update that would butt up against your existing use status in some way. What would be the things that you could do in order to potentially have that happen if you are in an overlay zone as future applied or what have you, right? That seems like something
Right,
that
so
would be
setting those
great for them to
standards.
have addressed.
Yeah, I'd be curious in that.
Because there are, I mean, you know, things change and things get really old and outdated, particularly if it's, you know, a big chain hotel or something, and you want to maybe fit with the character of the town a little more, so.
Or if it's a very old home in an overnight, I mean, it's not just hotels, I don't think, it's like, also could be just a home that's able to be nightly rental because it's on West Center, for example.
And they have a business license.
Yeah, but what we're saying is like, can you tear the house down and do like a sixplex?
If it was
If it-
grandfathered, no,
That's what I'm asking.
currently, right?
Right.
But do we want to make
Is it gonna
allowances
increase
for
the
that?
number?
Right.
No.
No.
Well, you could
Okay,
offer
that's
some
direction.
density bonuses in order to get mixed use.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that you could incentivize
I think we should have
mixed
them
use.
advise on how we
Yeah.
could get mixed use with minor density bonuses.
So allow for more nightly rental units if they do
Yeah,
residential.
yes.
Wait,
Oh.
more?
Mixed use.
A way in the future, maybe that
She
could be
said, that's why I'm
employed.
repeating what she said.
Like ground floor retail or residential, or have them advise on what they think that could be, just so that we can continue to evolve and update our form of our city, you know, like what the buildings look like.
So more overnight rental possibility if they.
Maybe they can have 5 more units for a 150-room hotel if they make the entire ground floor retail or something like that.
But certainly nothing that we are going to do right now. Again, ideas from Landmark.
Right. But,
No, but for right now, redevelopment cannot actualize more units is what the direction sounds like it is.
For right now.
But then
Okay.
in the overlay, that redevelopment could potentially actualize more units.
yeah, and we're
Is
saying,
that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
but we're saying for number 4, hey, we're hiring you, so come up with an idea of how we can
Right.
achieve mixed use. And
In
give-
some future time.
yeah, give us that as an overlay option that we could apply.
Okay.
Emily, it's difficult having those discussions with a house compared, I mean, I feel like this is all, it has to do with hotels, unfortunately. I mean, like, that's a bigger issue. And so, you know, if it's a home and it's a bed and breakfast,
If it's a Williams Way condo,
yes,
they could tear down a duplex and they could build up to 40 feet high and they could do a 6-unit if they wanted, if there were no restrictions on redevelopment.
Except if you're using Williams Way condo, their CCNRs are going to.
But if there was something like that.
okay, sorry.
But something like that, yeah.
Unless they changed their CCNRs.
Right.
To allow that.
Right.
So it's just important to have that clarified, whether it's increasing by 2 or by 20 or 200. It sounds like
We don't want the
not
increase.
right now.
Not right now.
Yeah?
But we would like Landmark to tell us what our options might be X years from now,
Yeah.
when we decide that we need more.
If you own a bed and breakfast and you have undeveloped, like an area that you were thinking you might do another home for rental, that's not allowed.
Correct,
For long-term rental or short-term?
Short-term,
correct.
that would not be allowed.
Under what it sounds like council is proposing to do before the moratorium ends, yes.
Okay. So are we okay with the redevelopment piece? All right. Number 5, county council will need to decide if it is open to any forms of new overnight lodging in the areas of US 191, SR 313, Crest Junction, Thompson Springs, or Cisco.
Yes, they will.
Yes, they will.
I was just gonna say, I don't know if anyone else went to their meeting or watched the other night, but it was my impression from the latest I've seen that they decided not to expand into any of those areas until if and when, you know, residents in those areas ask for a change. That was my impression.
Okay, good. So that's done with number 5. And then number 6 goes into community node locations. And I think that this is a little bit outside our scope right now if we're trying to finish up things that we have to get done before August.
But it's a really good idea, and we want to follow up on it.
Exactly.
But just to clarify, community node would not include overnight rental.
That's correct.
So, okay.
Right.
So so council has time to look at that.
Nora, can I just, as we move forward with the community node thing, maybe just at some point, can you come back and give us, as you get to know our zones, an impression if that would just be maybe rezoning some things, or basically just more C5? I mean, because we think of the C5 as our neighborhood commercial zone now, and I'm just wondering
That's a good point.
if that's what we're talking about, is just more
I mean,
C5.
we may want to take a look at the zone and see if it works, or if we want to make modifications to it. That may be one way we can achieve it.
I have to go back to redevelopment, and I apologize to everyone, but like if somebody has a campground and wants to turn it into a hotel or a very large bed and breakfast operation or
Which they can't do in the code.
whatever. I mean, if somebody wanted to change.
The city, I mean, the county has opted to say no to that, and
Or to
my
a
gut
hostel,
instinct
yeah.
is that's a good direction.
Yeah. I mean, if it's a non-conforming existing use, it would no longer fall within the definition of its existing use for a change like that. So, I mean, it answers itself
Right.
legally.
So no, couldn't happen. I
Yeah,
could not
because
turn my,
campground is different than hotel, so you
Yeah.
can't have one for the
right.
others.
I could not turn my 50 campsites into a 50-unit hostel. Couldn't do it.
Because campground RV will be removed as a use, as a use.
And that is
Okay.
something that we need to be clear on. When we do remove overnight rentals, it is also removing campgrounds and RVs, new campgrounds and RVs.
What
So
was
just-
I was unable to make the meeting on Tuesday, and I haven't watched the recording of it yet, but what was county council's discussion for anyone who was there or
I was
watched
there.
about the campground issue, Nora?
Were you there?
I know.
I've been to so many meetings, I can't remember
Same
what meetings I've been to and where other people were, but
Can
I
I
was
just
there.
reiterate how glad we are to have you here now? I mean, seriously.
There was, one of the council members was uncomfortable with the direction. And that was what we've just been going over, and wanted to make sure that the rest of the county council understood it and was on board. And all the county council members that were there were a couple missing, were supportive of the direction and are generally, alternative 5. And they expressed support for that. They also took public input, and the public input was all in favor, I believe. It was all in favor of no new additional nightly rentals, at least for a while.
Was the campground, was there a
They
discussion?
didn't talk about
Okay.
the campground thing. They did with the planning commission at a previous meeting.
I mean, I'd like to see, and this is like super speculative in the future, if, I don't know if there was a way, a scaling back that you could incentivize where, say, you have, I don't know, I feel like campgrounds potentially, and there's some comments I know that have been received by Landmark or from the public saying that, there should be more opportunities for things like campgrounds, where, the sort of the highest and best overnight rental is a big box hotel, and for something that would maybe incentivize, if we are talking about redevelopment, if there was not going from a campground to a hotel, but going to a hotel or a 10-unit, whatever, to a campground or something like that. I don't know, that might be way, way far outside of the scope.
There's something called transfer of development rights. Has anyone heard of these?
Landmark proposed them as a tool,
Yeah.
but for some reason didn't.
They can get messy and difficult to manage if we don't have a lot of staff, but it is an opportunity for certain businesses to purchase development rights from other businesses. So a hotel could potentially, in exchange for creating an easement on another property for a preserved open space for a park for the community, they could purchase more density from another parcel. So if the second parcel were to remain completely open space, the hotel could, or indefinitely, the hotel could have more density from that parcel and other exchanges like that.
Would that parcel also be, that they're purchasing from, also be overnight rental? Because I think if it's not, that doesn't address the community concerns with more rooms or more units, right?
Nora, I'm sure, has way more experience.
Yeah.
TDRs are a little tricky because it depends on what's allowed by right, what's allowed you know, if you already have a lot of, you know, density, if you have what you want in terms of density and building height and those kinds of things, then you're not in a position necessarily to identify any receiving zones. I mean, that's what happens.
Yeah.
You have to have areas where you transfer density from, and those are easy to identify, right? Because, you know, open space, blah, blah, blah. But it's a little bit harder to find those zones, those places where you want to transfer and make them more dense over the zoning that exists there today. So it's not impossible, and people do it. But, you know, we tried to do it in Summit County, and we got into value. You know, if you've got an acre of farmland, you know, what's the value of that, and how many units therefore should you get versus if you have, you know, a commercial building. And so that value discussion sort of bogged things down. But it is a really innovative tool, especially if you're trying to achieve open space.
Yeah. So I do realize that city council loves to have 7 and 8 hour meetings. Planning commission does not. So we have covered the 6 items that we were supposed to cover tonight.
Perfect. 2 hours.
What I'd like to do is, if there are any further comments, that'd be great. Helen?
So there was also a list, like, before the moratorium ends and after the moratorium ends. And one thing after the moratorium ends, these lists were kind of focused on land use code changes. And it seems like just we still may well end up with 6,200 plus lodging units a few years from now. So I think another long-term thing for us to address, and it may be more the county than us, but just what is our vision for the tourism sector in our economy? Because to some extent, the lodging is a symptom of our success, but it's not. If there was less noise and less crowding, and our residents may be more accommodating of it and appreciative of the benefits it brings.
And I think those are some of the things that we could bring up in our next general plan revision. I think that may be where some of those ideas belong.
Can I just add to that? One of the points that Keelan, I noticed, had raised, I don't know if it was in some email or in conversation, but was the fact that, you know, whatever decisions the city and county make are one thing, but we also have lodging that is provided by federal agencies, so whether it's the Forest Service, the BLM, Park Service, and so, you know, there's always a chance that campgrounds there will grow, and we should just keep in mind that that could add to our visitation as well. So I think you had raised the point at one point that it might be good to invite the agencies in on these conversations, and I didn't know if they had been part of the smaller meetings you guys were having.
No.
But probably good at some point to, I mean, I thought it was a good idea to include them.
Particularly because I know there's a discussion that's starting about seeing if federal and state entities will allow the TRT on those things.
Right.
So, Kayla, what I hear you saying is that we also need to address the impacts that our lots of accommodations in our tourism economy is putting on the residences, and maybe there's ways other than zoning to deal with some of those impacts, right?
Right, like it may have to do with how the travel council, with the consent of the county council, spends the advertising TRT budget.
Or transit, like a shuttle.
Yeah, transportation in
bypass.
general.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or community
Things like that.
nodes. I think that will help just kind of centralize things, so I don't have to drive across town and across Main Street to do anything.
Exactly.
Right, or if the north, if RC actually becomes more of a destination in and of itself,
Yeah.
maybe there's less
Right.
less driving into downtown, and development of that actually benefits the overall
Yeah.
experience.
If you come to town to go to Arches and Canyonlands, stay in the RC, eat in the RC, shop in the RC, get your gas in the RC, and then go to Arches in the morning, and then leave north. That takes pressure off of the center of town, for sure.
She's not
And
saying
the-
you
or-
have to
and
do
the-
that.
Yeah, well, I'm saying, I mean,
And shuttle into downtown
Right.
and shop
Yeah.
and eat.
yeah.
So there are external opportunities beyond that are worth us working on. at the conclusion of this moratorium.
Anything else?
I think, we haven't had a joint meeting in a while, but I know something that we've been talking about Planning Commission is we have our own sort of wish list or things to address about other code changes that could potentially be form-based to, you know, if there's something that we'd like to see, you know, because there are impacts to town that aren't just stemming out of overnight rentals, and we want to, you know, then pivot back to those too. So there are some things, whether it's height or, you know, density or what have you, things in the code that don't seem to gel with the wants of the community, just like totally use by right overnight rentals didn't seem to gel with the wants of the community.
So once this big effort is over, once the moratorium is over and we have something at least for a while, I will be coming back to you and so that you can tell me what those priorities might be. Because we can't do everything at once. And
For sure.
We'll need council direction and planning commission direction on priorities for sure. There's a long list.
Yes.
Allison, thank you for inviting us to your meeting.
I would like to thank everybody out there for sitting through our discussions. And again, if you have any comments, there are comment cards here that we would love to hear from you, whether you think our decisions are good or bad or
Shall we
in between.
have a motion to adjourn?
Is there a motion to adjourn?
I motion to adjourn the joint city and council and planning commission meeting.
Do I have a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. We are adjourning the meeting at 7:06 PM. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Good job.